Can you imagine walking through a city where fashion itself was an invitation to scandal? In Sodom, women didn't just defy the standards of the time, they completely destroyed them. While in other ancient cities, modesty was synonymous with respect. In Sodom, boldness was the passport to prestige. There, every street was transformed into a kind of stage of seduction, where bodies were displayed like living works of art, adorned in ways that shocked even visitors most accustomed to the excesses of the ancient world. Records and traditions describe fabrics so fine that light passed through their fibers as if they were liquid glass. These were no ordinary garments. They were veils of calculated transparency, revealing more than they hid. The women of Sodom wore layers of this shimmering fabric, which reflected like dewdrops in the sun, and at night seemed made of pure light under the moon. It wasn't just fashion, it was a ritual. During festivals, bodies were painted with liquid gold dyes that shimmered on contact with the skin, creating an almost supernatural aura. Imagine an entire square illuminated by the reflection of these golden bodies, moving to the rhythm of hypnotic music, as if the city itself pulsed with lust. This fabric, made with such sophisticated techniques that it was lost forever after the destruction of Sodom, was a true masterpiece of weaving. It is said to have been so light it could fit through a ring, yet so strong that it supported the weight of gold. Necklaces, bracelets, and anklets that women wore as status symbols. Foreign merchants traveled for months just to obtain small fragments of these garments, paying prices comparable to entire palaces. It was fashion transformed into economic power, sensuality converted into currency of prestige. But there was more. These garments weren't just worn to enchant. They were part of a system of female power that scandalized neighboring peoples. In Sodom, a woman wasn't just someone's wife or daughter. She was a business owner, a landowner, and a manager of commercial establishments. This freedom, coupled with the way they defied convention with their painted bodies and transparent clothing, was seen as proof that Sodom had upended all known social and spiritual orders. Imagine a foreigner walking through the city gates at dusk. The sun, reflecting off the reddish brick walls, gave the impression that Sodom was burning from within. And upon entering, instead of finding modesty and hospitality, he found women parading in translucent garments, exotic perfumes in the air, and laughter echoing through the alleys. The shock lay not only in the sensuality, but in the stark contrast to the culture from which they came. What in their homeland would be considered shameful, in Sodom was celebrated as glory. These garments, combined with the liquid gold used to paint their bodies, transformed the women into veritable priestesses of pleasure. During full moon nights, temple rituals mingled with public festivals. Their gleaming bodies reflected the moonlight, magnified by the polished metal mirrors that decorated the altars. It was as if the entire city had been designed to bewitch the senses. Seen from afar, Sodom resembled a golden mirage. Up close, it revealed itself to be a spectacle of carefully choreographed excess. It's not difficult to understand why the ancient world associated Sodom with sin. But perhaps the most disturbing detail is this. For the inhabitants, there was no sin at all. For them, it was culture, it was power, it was identity. Seduction was not just a private practice, it was a public value, a way of life. And this way of life, taken to the extreme, became a direct provocation to the spiritual and moral laws that governed their neighbors. Now think with me. If you lived in a society where everyone celebrated their bodies, where desire was public and seduction was the currency of power, how would that shape your perception of right and wrong? Would you see it as freedom or as the most dangerous form of imprisonment? If these first secrets of Sodom have already surprised you, take the opportunity to subscribe to the channel and leave your like. That way you ensure you won't miss the next revelations that are yet to come. If there was one thing that defined Sodom as much as its reputation for luxury, it was its walls. Imagine a traveler approaching the Vale of Siddim at sunset. From a distance, the city seemed engulfed in flames. It wasn't real fire, but the reflection of the setting sun on the reddish bricks of the walls, which glowed like live coals. This visual spectacle was the first demonstration of power. Sodom didn't just need to be rich, it needed to appear invincible. Accounts describe a monumental double line of defense. Two walls, one outer and one inner, rose over 10 meters high, the equivalent of a modern 3-story building. Between them, a strategic corridor allowed defenders to move quickly. hurling projectiles, boiling oil, or stones at any enemy who dared approach. The gates, made of wood reinforced with heavy metal, were so immense that they required 6 men to open. Upon passing through them, any visitor knew they were entering a place that brooked no weakness. This sense of invulnerability shaped the city's spirit. The inhabitants believed they were completely protected, untouchable, and when a people believe nothing can touch them, a dangerous blind trust is born. It's as if the architecture itself encouraged moral transgression. After all, who would dare challenge a city protected by such grandiose walls? And, feeling secure, the citizens of Sodom pushed boundaries others would never even dare imagine. The walls weren't just physical barriers, they were psychological symbols. To those who entered, they conveyed the message that Sodom was more powerful than any neighboring kingdom. To those who lived within them, they reinforced the idea that the city could indulge in all manner of excess without consequence. This false security was one of the mechanisms that fueled its decline. Modern archaeologists still find traces of these defense systems in the regions near the Dead Sea. Huge, carefully aligned stone blocks reveal engineering knowledge far beyond what was believed possible at the time. How did they move these stones? How did they erect such tall structures on arid, unstable terrain? Some theories suggest that bitumen, abundant in the region, was used as a natural cement, increasing the durability of the buildings. Other darker narratives claim that occult practices and even mysterious forces were invoked to build the city. As night fell, the spectacle was even more striking. Lit torches along the walls made the horizon glow orange and red, as if Sodom were a volcano about to erupt. The visitor arriving after a long journey through the desert saw not just a city, he saw a living, vibrant fortress that seemed to breathe power. This first impression, calculated to intimidate, paved the way for everything else. Endless parties, secret rituals, and excesses that would shock even modern standards. But what happens when a people believe they are unattainable? When the feeling of invulnerability mixes with the desire to break boundaries, the result is always devastating. Sodom believed its walls protected it from the outside world, but the true enemy didn't come from outside. It grew within them, silent, fueled by arrogance and contempt for spiritual and moral laws. Among all the riches that fueled Sodom's growth, none was as decisive as bitumen. Imagine walking through the region and finding small black springs bubbling in the ground, as if the earth itself exuded wealth. Bitumen, a dark, viscous and shiny substance, emerged spontaneously in pools that shimmered in the sun like lakes of liquid glass. To the ancient people, it was as if the city's subsoil were an inexhaustible mine of black gold. Entire caravans would travel weeks through the desert just to reach Sodom and acquire the valuable material. Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and even Phoenician traders competed for shipments to be used in sacred and vital functions. In Egypt, the bitumen of Sodom was considered indispensable. It was wrapped around the bodies of pharaohs during the mummification process, preserving them for eternity. It was also used in the construction of ceremonial boats that glided down the Nile in grand rituals. Its value was so high that a single shipment could purchase land, slaves, and even small palaces in neighboring kingdoms. In Sodom, this abundance transformed daily life. Where other cities had to dig mines or rely on imported resources, inhabitants simply gathered what the earth offered spontaneously. This black gold was sold in hardened blocks or clay jars, sealed and transported long distances. The bitumen trade enriched not only merchants, but also the entire Sodomite society, creating a powerful elite that flaunted luxury on every corner of the city. But all easy wealth comes at a price. Bitumen began to shape not only the economy, but also the character of its inhabitants. The prosperity that should have inspired gratitude bred arrogance. With so much money flowing in, the city began to value pleasure over work, luxury over simplicity. Lavish feasts became routine. Banquets showcased rare meats and spices brought from distant regions, and women, adorned with heavy jewelry, became walking symbols of their wealth. This abundance also reinforced the sense of impunity. If the soil itself yielded riches effortlessly, why worry about moral boundaries? Why respect ancient traditions if Sodom seemed to live by its own laws, sustained by a resource no other city possessed in such abundance? It was in this context that spiritual corruption began to spread. Bitumen became not only a symbol of prosperity, but also of the moral degradation that slowly consumed the heart of the city. Interestingly, this same resource that sustained Sodom may have been one of the elements that sealed its destruction. Bitumen is highly flammable, and many scholars suggest that its abundant presence underground may have intensified the violence of the catastrophe that consumed the city. Imagine underground pools and veins of flammable material being hit by an explosive event. What was once a source of wealth became fuel for ruin. The fire that fell from the sky found fertile ground to turn Sodom to ash. This paradox is disturbing. The city relied on its wealth as a sign of protection and power, but this same treasure became an instrument of destruction. Bitumen, which preserved pharaohs and sustained sacred vessels, became the substance that fueled the fire of divine justice. Now reflect for a moment. How often in history, and even in our personal lives, does what seems like the greatest blessing turn into a trap? Sodom believed its abundance was a sign of invulnerability, but easy wealth eroded its humanity to the point of no return. If you had access to a resource that granted you unlimited power and wealth, how would you use this privilege? To strengthen your community, or to live as if nothing had consequences? The answer to this question may say more about Sodom and about us than we realize. For centuries, the destruction of Sodom was told as a myth, a moral warning conveyed by Scripture. Many believed it was merely a parable of divine justice, a religious metaphor with no historical basis. But in recent decades, science has begun to reveal something disturbing. The event described in Genesis may have actually happened, and in a way even more terrifying than any ancient imagination could have conceived. In 1993, excavations on the shores of the Dead Sea revealed layers of ash and fragments of vitrified materials, as if stones had been melted at temperatures impossible for Bronze Age technology. Archaeologists found traces of fused silica, tiny microscopic spheres that could only have formed under intense heat, similar to that of a modern nuclear explosion. It was as if, in an instant, the ground itself had been transformed into a red-hot furnace. Analysis indicates that the event occurred around 1700 BC, coinciding with the time traditionally attributed to Abraham. The phenomenon was so devastating that the lands of the region remained barren for centuries, unable to produce any crops. Evidence preserved in the traditions of neighboring peoples speaks of a sky that turned red as blood, a mushroom cloud that rose to the heavens, and scorching winds that swept away everything in its path. Modern scientists have proposed a theory known as airburst, similar to the Tunguska event in Siberia in 1908. According to this hypothesis, a small asteroid or comet exploded in mid-air, releasing energy equivalent to hundreds of atomic bombs. The shockwave would have flattened buildings in seconds, while the heat, hotter than the surface of the sun, incinerated living beings instantly. Imagine houses, walls, and temples turning to dust in a fraction of a second. But it wasn't just science that found clues. Scripture describes Abraham, from afar, seeing smoke rising as from a furnace. This description strikingly matches what modern witnesses would report upon an aerial explosion. A column of fire, followed by a cloud of dust rising to the heavens. The detail of Lot's wife being transformed into a pillar of salt also gains new interpretation in light of geology. The Vale of Sodom, where Sodom was located, is rich in salt deposits. People exposed to extreme heat could have been instantly calcined, their bodies covered in crystals, creating shapes resembling petrified human figures. Evidence of crystallized sulfur has also been found in the region, with nearly pure balls of the chemical element embedded in the soil. They burn with intense blue flames when lit, exactly as described in ancient texts that speak of fire and brimstone falling from the sky. The combination of the biblical narrative and archaeological findings creates a disturbing picture. Sodom was indeed destroyed by an unprecedented natural catastrophe interpreted by the ancients as divine judgment. What's most striking is the psychological legacy of this event. The shock was so profound that it spanned centuries, spreading across different cultures. Civilizations as distant as the Greeks and Mesopotamians preserved similar stories of cities consumed by fire from the sky. It was as if the collective memory could not forget that night when the world seemed to fall apart. Now consider this. If an entire society can be annihilated in seconds by a force from heaven, what does this teach us about the fragility of human civilization? No matter how many walls Sodom had, no matter how much wealth it accumulated, Nothing could protect it from a sudden and irreversible fate. Perhaps this is the most disturbing lesson. No matter the power or glory of a city, it only takes an instant for it all to turn to dust. Sodom didn't just disappear from the earth, it vanished as a warning, an eternal mark that no society is invulnerable to the forces that govern the universe. Now it's your turn. If you witnessed the sky turning red and an explosion hotter than the sun destroying everything in seconds, would you believe it was just a natural phenomenon, or would you see it as divine judgment? Share your perspective below. In no other city in the ancient world was the image of women so deeply associated with gold as in Sodom. There, the female body was not only admired, but transformed into a living symbol of wealth, status, and power. Archaeologists have found female skeletons with strange marks, neck and ankle bones, deformed by the constant weight of necklaces and bracelets worn since youth. Imagine growing up carrying jewelry so heavy that your own body was molded by it. This was the reality for the women of Sodom, adorned to the point of becoming walking showcases of luxury. Walking through the city streets, the sound was unmistakable, the metallic clink of jewelry clashing with every step. There was no mistaking a common woman for a Sodomite aristocrat. The volume of the sound announced her social standing. At festivals, this metallic clang became almost a symphony, mingled with laughter, music, and the glow of torches reflected off hundreds of necklaces and rings. The effect was so overwhelming that, according to ancient accounts, the nights of celebration seemed to turn into days, illuminated by the collective reflection of gold. But gold in Sodom wasn't just adornment, it was also an instrument of power. Unlike other cultures of the ancient world, women in Sodom enjoyed unusual independence. They could manage property, start businesses, and even seek divorce. The gold worn on their bodies wasn't just aesthetic, it was the embodiment of their authority. These women, resplendent with jewels, were also merchants, diplomats, and even leaders of religious rituals. Luxury was conflated with freedom, and this mixture was seen by neighboring peoples as an affront to the natural order of things. It's important to remember that in other cities, women's bodies were often silenced, limited to domestic roles. In Sodom, on the contrary, they were exalted and projected into public space, becoming a weapon of seduction and influence. This female visibility fueled the reputation of Sodom as a city of inverted mores, where the laws governing masculinity and femininity in other cultures were openly challenged. However, there was a hidden price to this extreme luxury. The weight of the jewelry deformed bodies, the metallic dyes used on the skin left toxic residues, and the dependence on gold as a symbol of identity corroded the human essence. What should have been a symbol of beauty and autonomy also became a physical and spiritual burden. Women carried on their bodies not only ornaments, but also the marks of the decadence of a city that had confused power with vanity. During the great celebrations, visitors were mesmerized. Imagine entering a square lit by hundreds of torches and seeing dozens of women covered from head to toe in gold, dancing in movements calculated to reflect the light. The spectacle was as fascinating as it was disturbing. It wasn't just a party, it was a ritual of collective ostentation that made it clear to everyone Sodom was the capital of excess. And yet, behind the brilliance, a shadow grew. This female independence, marked by gold, was seen by neighboring peoples not as a sign of progress, but as corruption. For them, allowing women to wield so much power was tantamount to destabilizing the natural order of the world. Perhaps this is why Sodom became a universal symbol of transgression, not only for its lust, but for the inversion of traditional roles that shocked neighboring societies. Gold, power, and freedom, three elements that could have built a just society. But in Sodom, they became drivers of arrogance, vanity, and excess. The result was a city that was brilliant on the outside but corroded on the inside. Now I ask, when beauty is confused with power and luxury becomes more important than essence, what remains of humanity? Did Sodom fall solely because of its immorality, or also because it lost the ability to distinguish between glory and destruction? If there was anything that epitomized the spirit of Sodom, it was its festivals. And we're not talking about ordinary celebrations, but social rituals that transformed the entire city into a stage for limitless excess. Ancient accounts describe celebrations that began on the new moon and ended only at the full moon, 2 full weeks of non-stop music, dancing, and feasting. Imagine walking through entire streets covered in colorful flowers, ribbons strung between columns and balconies, while every corner vibrated to the sound of drums, flutes, and harps. The entire city became a living arena, pulsating to the rhythm of collective pleasure. During these periods, Sodom ceased to be merely an economic center and became a continuous spectacle. The squares were filled with immense tables made of imported cedar, covered with roasted meats, breads scented with rare herbs, and goblets overflowing with aged wines. The streets, lit by hundreds of torches, seemed never to know darkness. To foreign visitors, the vision was of a paradise of abundance. But to those who observed more closely, it was also a portrait of a society that had resolved to erase any boundary between order and chaos. The most shocking detail of these celebrations was that, for the duration, all the city's normal laws were suspended. What might have been punishable on ordinary days was encouraged during the festivals. Forbidden relationships, violent games, life or death bets, all found space under the guise of temporary freedom. It was as if Sodom had institutionalized chaos as part of its culture. This reversal of values not only fueled the city's reputation, but also exposed the danger of a society that confused liberation with self-destruction. Visitors from other cities often reported their astonishment. Many fled in terror after witnessing acts that in their lands would have been considered blasphemy or a crime. But for the inhabitants of Sodom, this suspension of laws was a source of pride. To them, it was proof that they lived above the restrictions imposed by other peoples. The greater the excess, the more evident became the idea that Sodom was different, special, destined to live outside the boundaries that governed the rest of the world. It is in this contrast that the secret of its decline lies, because a society that lives without limits, even temporarily, ends up absorbing chaos into its essence. What began as an exception at parties gradually became the norm in everyday life. And when the boundaries between pleasure and responsibility disappear, the result is inevitable. Disorder infiltrates the deepest structures. Archaeologists have found remains of fine pottery, fragments of musical instruments, and the bones of sacrificed animals that confirm the impressive scale of these feasts. But beyond the objects, the very silence of the ruins of the Sodom Valley testifies that no feast, no matter how brilliant, can sustain a civilization. The echo of these celebrations has been lost to time, replaced by the silence of a land marked by destruction. Sodom's festivals, which should have been moments of joy, became symbols of collective arrogance. Every banquet, every dance, every night when the laws were abolished was another step toward ruin. Because in the end, it wasn't just the food or the music that sustained these festivals, but the belief that nothing could stop the city. And the question remains that echoes through time. Every civilization seeks spaces to celebrate, but what happens when these celebrations become a pretext to eliminate all limits? How far can a people advance before freedom is corrupted and becomes nothing more than slavery to one's own instincts? Among the many aspects that made Sodom unique, few were as disturbing and fascinating as its temples dedicated to foreign deities, especially Astarte, the goddess of love and fertility. These places were not just centers of worship, they were stages of power where ordinary women transformed themselves into revered priestesses, endowed with an authority few ancient cultures would dare grant. Imagine a temple built with tall columns carved into stylized trees, as if to unite the city with the sky itself. The open ceiling allowed the full moon to bathe the central altar in its silvery light. Polished metal mirrors adorned the walls, multiplying the brightness of the torches into hypnotic reflections that seemed to dance with the priestesses' every movement. As night fell and the moon reached its highest point, the entire space transformed into a sacred and sensual spectacle. The most respected women wore blue robes embroidered with silver threads that glittered like stars. Their hair was braided with flowers and adorned with crowns of glittering stones. Every detail was carefully planned to create an atmosphere of mystery, where the boundaries between the spiritual and the physical dissolved. During these ceremonies, ancient accounts say that the earth itself trembled to the sound of the chants and deep drums, as if all of Sodom were being dragged into a collective trance. Unlike other cities in the ancient world, in Sodom, the priestesses weren't just ritual attendants. They wielded real power. They could influence political decisions, guide trade negotiations, and even mediate conflicts. Their temples functioned as centers of social influence, where religion, sensuality, and politics were inextricably intertwined. For many foreigners, this was definitive proof that Sodom had inverted the natural order. Instead of kings and warriors dictating the rules, it was women, with their rituals, perfumes, and enchantments, who silently governed the city's course. Archaeological excavations near the Dead Sea have uncovered remains that confirm some of these descriptions. Black stone altars, female statuettes in positions of power, inscriptions alluding to the moon and fertility. Everything indicates that these temples were much more than legends passed down through tradition. They were real, and their influence was so strong that it shaped not only the spiritual life, but also the very daily life of the city. But behind this fascination lay something even darker. Because when a society elevates the cult of pleasure and female power above any moral limits, it also opens the door to practices that defy all conventions. Stories preserved in ancient traditions speak of nocturnal rituals in which bodies were painted with golden oils, and ecstatic dances transformed the ceremonies into something that neighbors described as pure depravity. What to the inhabitants of Sodom was seen as spiritual freedom, to the neighboring peoples seemed like scandalous idolatry. The big question is, was Sodom's true sin, in the eyes of those who condemned it, actually immorality, or the very fact of allowing women to achieve such influence? Because in a world dominated by patriarchs, Sodom was the exception, a place where priestesses held more power than kings. And then comes the dilemma that resonates to this day, when religion mixes with sensuality, power, and desire. At what point is spirituality legitimate, and where does manipulation begin? In Sodom, these boundaries blurred, and the moon temples became not only symbols of worship, but also of a power that changed the city's destiny. If there was one thing that truly distinguished Sodom from all other cities in the ancient world, it was its treatment of strangers. In almost every ancient culture, from Egypt to Mesopotamia, hospitality was considered a sacred virtue, a moral obligation before gods and men. But in Sodom, this tradition was corrupted until it became its opposite. There, helping a stranger was not a sign of kindness, but a crime punished with extreme severity. Imagine the scene. An exhausted traveler, after days of traversing the scorching desert, finally caught sight of the reddish walls of Sodom glowing in the sunset. The city seemed an oasis of wealth and prosperity, but as he approached the gates, what he encountered were hostile stares and closed doors. The inhabitants saw this stranger not as a guest, but as prey. If any resident dared to offer a piece of bread or even a cup of water without charging, they risked being flogged in the public square or, in more extreme cases, executed. Ancient accounts tell of punishments so cruel they seem unthinkable even today. One of the most disturbing stories is that of a young woman named Pelatit, who was allegedly sentenced to death simply for feeding a starving beggar. The sentence was neither swift nor merciful. She was tied to a wall covered in honey and left at the mercy of insects and the scorching sun until she slowly died in agony. This episode symbolizes the total perversion of Sodom's values. Compassion, which should have been celebrated, was punished as a crime. The laws against foreigners weren't just a reflection of wanton cruelty. They revealed the mentality of a city that believed itself untouchable, protected by imposing walls and enriched by abundant natural resources. When a society convinces itself it no longer needs anyone, it creates an arrogance that corrodes the collective heart. Sodom didn't just reject hospitality, it turned hostility into a public spectacle. Papyri and oral traditions describe that, at dusk, special bells would ring whenever travelers were seen crossing the gates. This was the announcement that a new fun was about to begin. Foreigners were often captured, tied up, and displayed in squares, forced to participate in sadistic games invented by the local population. Some were forced to dance on hot coals, while others were used as targets in violent games. What should have been a source of shame was celebrated as part of the culture. This distorted legal system was one of the main reasons Sodom came to be seen as a universal symbol of moral depravity. By institutionalizing cruelty, the city proved that it wasn't just occasional excesses, but a way of life, a place where justice no longer protected the weak, but served only to consolidate the power of the strong and satisfy their most brutal instincts. Archaeological excavations in the Dead Sea region have uncovered evidence of practices that corroborate these accounts. Inscriptions mentioning collective punishment, remains of structures used as public punishment sites, and even bones showing signs of extreme violence. All of this points to a society that had normalized brutality as official law. And here the question arises, what happens to a civilization when helping someone ceases to be a virtue and becomes a crime? To what extent can a society survive when kindness is considered a weakness and cruelty is celebrated as a strength? Sodom, in its arrogance, believed itself above all moral rules, but by completely inverting the value of compassion, it began to pave its own ruin. The city's tragic fate thus becomes a timeless warning. When a culture decides to punish kindness and reward cruelty, how long is left before it loses all its humanity? In Sodom, abundance wasn't limited to the walls, the gold, or the tar. It also manifested itself in the endless tables of the palaces and the private parties that marked the city's calendar. The banquets of Sodom became legendary, not only for the quantity of food, but for the way they transformed eating into a spectacle of power. Imagine vast cedar halls lit by bronze lamps, where long tables were lost in the shadows. On them, piles of smoked meat, exotic fruits preserved in honey, and wines aged. For decades formed a feast fit for kings. The secret behind this abundance was the advanced preservation techniques the inhabitants mastered. The abundant salt from the Dead Sea, combined with smoking and fermentation methods, allowed food to last for years without spoiling. Archaeologists have found sealed vessels that still contained identifiable remains of meat, grains, and fruits, preserved like time capsules. In Sodom, famine was never a threat, and it was precisely this security against scarcity that fueled a dangerous cycle of waste and extravagance. At grand feasts, it wasn't enough to simply feed oneself. One had to impress. Servants brought ceramic trays laden with fragrant breads, jugs of wine passed from hand to hand, and desserts made with figs, dates, and rare spices. Guests reclined on divans covered in fine fabrics, while musicians played soft melodies to lull the evening. The contrast was stark. While neighboring peoples struggled to survive droughts and plagues, Sodom seemed to mock scarcity, transforming abundance into a spectacle. But what was most shocking was the way these banquets challenged traditional values. In many cultures, food was sacred, a symbol of blessing and sharing. In Sodom, it became a weapon of ostentation. Hosts often displayed food preserved from previous generations, as if to prove they possessed so much that they could nourish not only the living, but also the memory of their ancestors. Eating in Sodom wasn't just about satisfying the body. It was about declaring superiority over time, nature, and even the gods. And as with everything in the city, excess had its price. Food was wasted in obscene quantities, thrown away simply to demonstrate that there were no limits. Whole animals were sacrificed in night-long banquets, while leftovers were discarded in rivers of honey and wine. For the Sodomites, waste was not seen as a sin, but as a virtue, proof of a seemingly inexhaustible abundance. This behavior reinforced a collective mentality that Sodom lived above all natural laws. Scarcity, which in other regions shaped societies with prudence and solidarity, disappeared as a concept in Sodom. And without fear of famine, the city sank ever deeper into arrogance and self-sufficiency. The echoes of these banquets can still be heard in the region's ruins, fragments of luxurious pottery, the remains of exotic animal bones, and inscriptions mentioning endless feasts confirm that these feasts were not legend, but an everyday reality. And if the temples revealed the spiritual dimension of Sodom's decadence, the banquets revealed its materialistic heart, where nothing was sacred beyond immediate pleasure. The destruction of Sodom didn't just wipe a city off the map. It left a trail of memories, symbols, and warnings that resonate to this day, permeating religions, cultures, and even modern science. The name Sodom became synonymous with moral decadence, limitless excess, and arrogance in the face of divine and natural laws. More than a physical place, Sodom came to represent a mirror in which humanity observes its own vices and attempts to understand the limits of civilization. In biblical texts, Sodom is remembered as the ultimate example of divine justice, proof that no wall, wealth, or power can protect a society when it chooses arrogance over compassion. Prophets repeated its name as a warning to subsequent generations. Every city that abandons social justice and cultivates oppression risks following the same path. This message also echoed in other traditions, permeating cultures that never had direct contact with the Hebrews, but which preserved similar stories of cities consumed by fire from heaven. Modern archaeology has reinforced this legacy. Around the Dead Sea, ruins and layers of ash reveal that a catastrophic event truly occurred. Melted objects, burned bones, and deposits of crystallized sulfur confirm that the destruction was not merely metaphorical, but historical. Phanescience, in attempting to explain the phenomenon, ended up strengthening the narrative. Sodom fell not only spiritually, but also physically, as if nature itself had conspired to transform the city into an eternal lesson. However, Sodom's legacy goes beyond ruin. It reveals human duality, the ability to create wonders, such as imposing walls, endless banquets, and temples of extraordinary beauty, and, at the same time, the tendency to transform these achievements into instruments of arrogance and self-destruction. What remained were not just burned stones, but the question that spans millennia: how far can a society go without losing itself? And when we look at the modern world, the parallels are inevitable. We live in societies of abundance like Sodom, surrounded by technology, luxury, and seemingly inexhaustible resources. We celebrate freedom, but often confuse it with the absence of limits. We have created political and economic systems that promise security, but often ignore the most vulnerable. The echo of Sodom resonates in our illuminated cities, in our parties, in our unbridled consumption, reminding us that all abundance without responsibility can turn to ruin. The story of Sodom, therefore, is not just about the past. It is about the present and, above all, the future. It forces us to reflect: are we repeating the same mistakes? Are we building walls of pride and forgetting to nurture compassion? Are we transforming wealth into an instrument of justice or a seed of decay? In the end, perhaps this is the lost city's greatest legacy. Sodom didn't just disappear as a physical ruin, but remains an eternal warning etched into humanity's collective memory, and each generation must decide whether to heed this warning or ignore it until the fires fall again. If this journey through the heart of Sodom touched you, leave a like and check if you're subscribed to the channel right now. It helps keep this journey through history's hidden secrets alive. And don't stop there. Click on the video that's appearing on your screen and continue delving into revelations that almost no one dares to share.